What happens when a spoiled millionaire faces a no-nonsense judge? Watch as Jessica Halstead's arrogance collides with justice, leading to a lesson she and the courtroom will never forget. The courtroom was abuzz with murmurs as people filed in, eager to witness the highly publicized trial of Jessica Thornton. The Los Angeles County Courthouse, a place of justice and solemnity, had become a stage for a clash of privilege and accountability. This wasn't just any case. It was one involving a millionaire socialite whose entitlement and reckless behavior had finally landed her in hot water. Jessica Thornton, 24, arrived fashionably late, her every movement radiating arrogance. Draped in designer brands and oversized sunglasses, she strutted down the aisle as though it were a fashion runway rather than a court of law. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled. Her manicured nails glittered with gems, and her attitude screamed that this was all a waste of her time. Behind her, her visibly uncomfortable lawyer struggled to keep up, his face betraying a mix of embarrassment and frustration. The courtroom, used to quiet decorum, fell into an awkward hush as Jessica paused dramatically in the middle of the aisle. She waved her lawyer off dismissively to adjust her luxury handbag on the bench before finally taking her seat. Her late arrival had disrupted the proceedings, and the tension in the room was palpable. Moments later, the mood shifted as Judge Malcolm Reed entered. At 54 years old, Judge Reed was a towering figure, both physically and in reputation. Dressed in his black robe, his piercing gaze scanned the room, silencing any remaining whispers. Known for his fair yet firm handling of cases, Judge Reed had built a legacy of ensuring justice was served, regardless of wealth or status. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the room collectively stood. Everyone except Jessica, who hesitated before sighing loudly and standing with visible annoyance. Judge Reed took his seat and began the session, his calm authority setting the tone. The charges against Jessica were straightforward yet severe: reckless driving that endangered pedestrians and verbal harassment of a store clerk. However, the real spectacle wasn't the case itself, but Jessica's blatant disregard for the gravity of the situation. Her body language, slouched posture, crossed arms, and occasional eye rolls spoke volumes about her lack of respect for the court. Judge Reed, ever composed, began reading the charges, his voice steady and deliberate. As he outlined the details, Jessica leaned back in her chair, tapping her nails against the table in a show of impatience. Her dismissive attitude drew sharp glances from the gallery, where curious onlookers whispered among themselves. This was no ordinary day in court. On one side stood Jessica, a symbol of unchecked privilege and entitlement. On the other, Judge Reed, a champion of accountability and justice. The stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge both their worlds and leave everyone watching forever changed. The courtroom was tense as Jessica Halstead slouched in her seat, exuding entitlement with every gesture. Her designer dress and towering heels seemed out of place against the solemn atmosphere of the courthouse. But Jessica didn't seem to notice or care. She rolled her eyes as Judge Reed began outlining the charges, tapping her perfectly manicured nails on the wooden table in a deliberate show of impatience. "Miss Halstead, please confirm your identity," Judge Reed said, his calm, authoritative voice cutting through the murmurs of the courtroom. Jessica let out a heavy sigh, flipping her hair dramatically. "Yeah, that's me," she said, her tone drenched in indifference. Her lawyer, seated beside her, winced at her dismissive attitude, whispering urgently for her to show some respect. Jessica waved him off without a second thought. Judge Reed's piercing gaze lingered on her for a moment. "Miss Halstead, in this courtroom, decorum is not optional. I suggest you adjust your tone accordingly," he warned, his voice steady but firm. Jessica smirked, leaning back in her chair with a flippant shrug. "Whatever you say, Your Honor," she replied, her sarcasm drawing soft gasps from the audience. Her lawyer buried his face in his hands, visibly mortified. The judge resumed reading the charges: a pattern of parking violations, reckless driving that endangered pedestrians, and verbal harassment of a store clerk. Jessica's demeanor shifted from smugness to irritation as he detailed her actions. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath. "People are just overreacting because of who I am." Judge Reed paused, his gaze locking onto hers. "Miss Halstead, this is your final warning. You will not disrupt these proceedings again." Jessica ignored him, whispering to her lawyer loud enough for nearby attendees to hear. "It's just some tickets and drama queens exaggerating," she scoffed. "What's the big deal?" Her blatant disregard for the court's authority left the audience stunned. Judge Reed, however, remained composed, his expression unflinching. His silence spoke volumes, a stark contrast to Jessica's arrogance, which seemed to fuel her behavior. As the hearing continued, Jessica interrupted multiple times, accusing the judge of wasting her time. "I've got better things to do," she declared loudly. "Let's just get this over with." The tension in the room thickened. Every spectator, from seasoned lawyers to first-time observers, sat on edge, waiting for Judge Reed's response. Yet he didn't rise to her provocations. Instead, he calmly pressed forward, his measured demeanor a sharp contrast to her juvenile antics. The courtroom grew quieter as Judge Reed shifted his attention to the charges that had brought Jessica Halstead into his courtroom. The air seemed heavier as he began recounting the events in question, his voice steady but pointed. "Miss Halstead, the charges you face today are not trivial," he began. "They are evidence of reckless disregard for others and a troubling pattern of entitlement." Jessica crossed her arms, her expression one of mild irritation. It was clear she thought this entire ordeal was beneath her. But the details Judge Reed presented would challenge even her flippant attitude. Judge Reed described the first incident with precision. 2 weeks ago, you sped through a residential neighborhood in a luxury sports car, ignoring multiple speed limit signs, he said. Witnesses report that you nearly hit a mother and her child crossing the street. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Mrs. Alvarez, the mother in question, was present and visibly shaken. She sat clutching her hands tightly in her lap, her eyes filled with the memory of the close call. Judge Reed continued, "And then, at a high-end boutique the same day, you berated an employee for not attending to you quickly enough. You reportedly called them incompetent and demanded to speak to their manager." Jessica rolled her eyes and muttered, "That's not a crime." Judge Reed didn't react to her comment, but turned his attention to the 2 witnesses who had agreed to testify. Mrs. Alvarez took the stand first. Her voice trembled as she recounted the terrifying moment when Jessica's car had nearly struck her toddler. "It all happened so fast," Mrs. Alvarez said, her voice thick with emotion. "I saw the car speeding toward us. I screamed and yanked my son out of the way just in time. If I hadn't, I don't even want to think about what could have happened." Jessica shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but maintained her air of indifference. Next, Mr. Jameson, the boutique employee, testified about his encounter with Jessica. She was furious that another customer was being served ahead of her. He said, "When I tried to explain that I was helping someone else, she called me an idiot and demanded to know if I even knew how to do my job. It was humiliating." Despite the gravity of the testimonies, Jessica dismissed the accounts as exaggerations. "They're both blowing this out of proportion," she said with a dismissive wave. "I didn't actually hit anyone, and he just couldn't handle some constructive criticism." People need to stop being so sensitive. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, many spectators visibly shocked by her lack of remorse. Judge Reed held up a hand, and the murmur subsided. He turned his piercing gaze toward Jessica, his voice calm but firm. "Miss Halstead, your inability to recognize the seriousness of these incidents is precisely why we are here today," he said. "It is my responsibility to ensure you do not leave this courtroom without understanding the consequences of your actions." The tension in the room was palpable as Judge Reed prepared to deliver the next part of his statement. The courtroom was silent, the weight of Jessica's dismissive attitude pressing heavily on everyone present. Judge Reed, ever composed, set down his pen and adjusted his glasses. His calm, deliberate movements captured the room's attention. The stern look in his eyes seemed to pierce through Jessica's defiance. "Miss Kensington," he began, his voice measured and steady. "Your behavior in this courtroom is deeply concerning. This isn't just about the charges brought against you. It's about what your actions represent." Jessica smirked, leaning back in her chair. "Oh, please," she said with a scoff, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "This is just about parking tickets and some overreacting people. Why make it a big deal?" Judge Reed held her gaze, unfazed by her dismissive words. "Let me explain something to you," he said, his tone firm but calm. "The law exists to protect everyone equally, but when people in positions of privilege act as though they are above accountability, it undermines that principle. Do you understand the precedent that sets?" Jessica rolled her eyes, clearly not taking the moment seriously. Her lawyer subtly tugged at her sleeve, whispering something urgent, but Jessica waved him off. Yeah, whatever you say, Judge," she replied flippantly. A murmur rippled through the gallery, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. Judge Reed took a deep breath, his demeanor still composed. "Privilege," he continued, "is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it gives you opportunities others can only dream of. On the other, it blinds you to the struggles of those without it. You sit here today, not just accused of reckless behavior, but demonstrating a complete disregard for how your actions affect others." Jessica shifted uncomfortably, but forced a smirk to mask her unease. "Is this a courtroom or a lecture hall?" she quipped, eliciting audible gasps from the gallery. Her lawyer visibly cringed, burying his face in his hands. Judge Reed remained unshaken. "Your sarcasm only underscores the point I'm making," he said. "You fail to see the gravity of your actions, not because they are minor infractions, but because you've never been forced to consider their consequences." Jessica crossed her arms, her frustration building. "Why are you making an example out of me?" she snapped. "This isn't about justice. It's about proving a point." The room went deathly quiet. Judge Reed leaned forward slightly, his sharp eyes fixed on her. "You're right about one thing," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "This is about proving a point that no one, regardless of their social status, is above the law. And let me assure you, Miss Kensington, this court does not exist to cater to egos or entitlements." Jessica opened her mouth to retort, but closed it again, sensing the weight of the moment. Her earlier bravado began to waver, though she still clung to a facade of indifference. "I will not allow this court to be disrespected," Judge Reed continued, his tone growing firmer. "You came in here today believing this was a trivial matter. Let me be clear. Your actions have consequences. You endangered lives. And your dismissive attitude shows a troubling lack of accountability." Jessica's lawyer leaned in again, whispering furiously, but this time she didn't brush him off. Instead, she looked around the room, noticing for the first time the disapproving stares of the audience. A flicker of doubt crossed her face. Judge Reed picked up his pen and tapped it lightly against the desk, the sound echoing in the silent courtroom. "The law is not a game, Miss Kensington," he said, "and today, you're going to learn that firsthand." The tension in the room reached its peak, everyone waiting to see what the judge would do next. But instead of delivering his sentence, Judge Reed calmly set the stage for the next chapter in Jessica's journey, one that would challenge her views in ways she never expected. The air in the courtroom was electric, the audience on the edge of their seats as Judge Reed leaned back in his chair, studying Jessica with a measured gaze. Everyone waited for his decision, expecting fines or perhaps a short probation sentence. Jessica's confidence faltered under his silence, but her smirk returned quickly. She clearly believed no real consequences awaited her. Judge Reed broke the silence, his tone calm but resolute. Miss Kensington, after reviewing the evidence and considering your behavior here today, I believe a standard sentence would not suffice. Your actions stem from a deeper issue, a lack of accountability, empathy, and understanding of how your privilege affects others. Jessica blinked, her bravado fading slightly. What does that mean? She asked, her voice carrying a mix of irritation and unease. It means, Judge Reed replied, that your punishment will serve as an opportunity for growth, not just retribution. He picked up the sentencing document and began reading aloud. First, you will pay a fine of $10, which will be donated to a community fund for victims of reckless driving. Second, you will complete 150 hours of community service at the Harmony Youth Center. Jessica's jaw dropped. Community service? Are you serious? Judge Reed raised a hand to silence her. Yes, Miss Kensington, community service. And third, you will attend mandatory sensitivity and accountability training, designed to address the underlying issues that brought you here. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Even Jessica's lawyer seemed caught off guard by the unconventional sentence. Jessica's face turned red as she stood abruptly. This is ridiculous, she exclaimed. You're just trying to humiliate me. Judge Reed's voice remained steady, unshaken by her outburst. Miss Kensington, this is not about humiliation. It's about helping you understand the impact of your actions. Your privilege has shielded you from accountability for far too long. This sentence is designed to ensure that changes. Jessica glanced at her lawyer, seeking validation, but he simply shook his head, clearly out of arguments. This isn't fair, she muttered, crossing her arms. Judge Reed leaned forward, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. Fairness, Miss Kensington, is treating every individual with the dignity and respect they deserve, something you failed to do. This is about justice, not convenience. The courtroom fell silent once more. Jessica's frustration boiled over, but she said nothing further, realizing that Judge Reed wasn't going to budge. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, signaling the conclusion of the hearing. This court is adjourned, he said firmly, standing and walking out with his usual commanding presence. Jessica stood frozen, her mind racing. For the first time in her life, she wasn't able to escape the consequences of her actions with money or influence. The weight of what lay ahead began to sink in as the reality of community service and accountability training loomed before her. The vibrant chatter of children and the clatter of activity in the Harmony Youth Center hit Jessica like a wave as she stepped inside. It was a far cry from the polished marble floors and designer storefronts she was used to. The fluorescent lights were harsh. The air carried the faint smell of cleaning supplies, and the walls were covered in colorful posters with motivational quotes. For the first time in her privileged life, Jessica felt completely out of place. A no-nonsense woman approached her, clipboard in hand. "You're Jessica Kensington?" she asked, her voice brisk. Jessica nodded, still trying to process the unfamiliar surroundings. "I'm Brenda Carter, the director here," the woman continued. "Welcome to Harmony Youth Center. You will report to me for the duration of your community service. Let's start by assigning you to kitchen duty." Jessica's brows furrowed. "Kitchen duty? Like cooking?" Brenda raised an eyebrow. "No. Cleaning. Follow me." Jessica trailed after her, clearly annoyed but biting her tongue. The small kitchen was bustling with volunteers preparing meals for the kids. Brenda handed her a pair of gloves and a sponge. "The sinks are over there. Dishes need to be washed and dried. Let me know when you're done." Jessica stared at the pile of dishes in horror. "This has to be a joke," she muttered under her breath. Brenda didn't react, already moving on to supervise another volunteer. With a sigh, Jessica reluctantly began scrubbing, her manicured nails uncomfortably scraping against the gloves. Every so often, She glanced around, feeling the stares of other volunteers and children. As the hours dragged on, Jessica couldn't help but notice the resilience of those around her. Kids laughed and played despite their worn clothes and heavy stories. Volunteers moved with purpose, offering help and support wherever needed. Jessica felt an odd sense of displacement. Her usual sarcasm and entitlement had no place here. During lunch, Jessica was tasked with serving food. She approached a table where a young girl, no older than 14, sat alone, scribbling in a notebook. "Want some more pasta?" Jessica asked awkwardly. The girl looked up, her wide brown eyes meeting Jessica's. "No thanks. I'm good," she said softly. Jessica hesitated but sat down across from her. "What are you working on?" she asked, trying to fill the silence. The girl, who introduced herself as Tasha, smiled faintly. "My debate speech. We have a competition next week. I want to be a lawyer someday." Jessica blinked. "A lawyer? That's ambitious." Tasha nodded, her confidence shining through. "Yeah, people like us need to know how to fight for ourselves." "Right." Jessica didn't respond immediately. "People like us?" she finally asked. Tasha shrugged. "You know, people who don't get second chances. If you mess up, you're done. That's why I need to be perfect." Jessica's chest tightened. Tasha's words struck a chord she wasn't ready to confront. "You'll be great," she said, her voice uncharacteristically sincere. Later that day, Jessica found herself cleaning up art supplies in the activity room when Mr. Carter, the center's director, approached her. "How's it going?" he asked, his tone warm but curious. "It's fine, I guess," Jessica replied, not looking up. Mr. Carter studied her for a moment. "You're used to things being handed to you, aren't you?" Jessica bristled. "Excuse me?" He smiled gently. "I don't mean that as an insult. It's just, people like you don't usually end up here. But you've got an opportunity most people never get, to see the world from a different perspective." Jessica's instinct was to argue, to brush off his observation, but something stopped her. Instead, she asked, "What's the point? Cleaning dishes and organizing art supplies won't change anything." Mr. Carter's expression softened. "It's not about the tasks. It's about understanding the people who come here, their struggles, their resilience. That's what changes you." Jessica didn't respond, but his words lingered as she finished her task for the day. By the end of the week, Jessica felt the first cracks in her carefully constructed walls. She noticed things she hadn't before, the shy gratitude in a child's smile, the camaraderie among the staff, the stories of loss and perseverance that filled the air. Each day, the weight of her entitlement felt heavier, her previous attitude more distant. Jessica still grumbled about her assignments, but she began to take them more seriously. She even found herself sitting with Tasha again, helping her refine her debate speech. "You have to make them feel your words," Jessica said, surprising even herself with the advice. Tasha beamed. "Thanks, Miss Jessica." As Jessica left the center that day, her usual sense of superiority was replaced by something else: unease, curiosity, maybe even guilt. The world she had built for herself suddenly seemed smaller, less meaningful. She wasn't ready to admit it yet, but the seeds of change had been planted. Jessica's community service at the Harmony Youth Center might have started quietly, but the same couldn't be said for the uproar outside. The media, always hungry for stories involving the elite, latched onto her unconventional sentence like wildfire. News outlets ran headlines such as, "Socialite sentenced to serve the community. Is justice finally blind?" And "From riches to reality. Jessica Kensington's courtroom reckoning." Jessica's every move became a topic of public scrutiny. Paparazzi captured her walking into the youth center in simple clothes, a stark contrast to her usual designer wardrobe. Social media erupted with debates about her punishment, dividing public opinion. On platforms like Twitter and Instagram, Hashtags like hashtag justice for all and hashtag Jessica Learns trended for days. Some users praised Judge Reed for issuing a sentence that taught accountability. Finally, a punishment that actually means something. One tweet read. Another user commented, "More judges should take this approach. Actions have consequences, even for the rich." However, Jessica also had her defenders. "This is overkill," wrote one critic. "She didn't kill anyone. Why ruin her life over a few bad choices?" Others dismissed the youth center work as a PR stunt, questioning whether Jessica was genuinely learning anything or just going through the motions. The scrutiny took a toll on Jessica's socialite status. Friends from her privileged circle whispered behind her back, mocking her predicament. Invitations to exclusive events dried up, and brands she'd once been associated with quietly distanced themselves. Her family, accustomed to shielding Jessica from the consequences of her actions, faced their own backlash. The Kensington family embodies everything wrong with privilege. One op-ed claimed, calling for broader accountability for those born into wealth and power. Jessica tried to maintain a stoic facade, but the cracks in her confidence became increasingly visible. Inside, she felt the sting of humiliation, but also a gnawing sense of doubt. Was the punishment excessive, or had she truly failed to grasp the gravity of her actions? As debates raged, Judge Reed found himself thrust into the spotlight. When approached for a comment, he addressed the issue in his signature calm and measured tone. "This isn't about humiliating anyone," he told reporters during a brief courthouse interview. "It's about accountability and perspective. Miss Kensington's actions endangered lives and disrespected the very principles of our shared society. This sentence is an opportunity, not just for her, but for all of us, to reflect on the responsibilities that come with privilege." His statement went viral, sparking conversations about wealth, entitlement, and the role of restorative justice in addressing systemic inequities. Back at the youth center, Jessica couldn't escape the weight of public perception. Children and staff had seen the news, and some couldn't resist sly comments or skeptical glances. Even the paparazzi outside the building were a constant reminder of her fall from grace. Despite the pressure, Jessica began to feel the early stirrings of self-reflection. The noise of the outside world was loud, but the quiet lessons inside the youth center grew harder to ignore. Jessica's initial days at the Harmony Youth Center were marked by resentment and resistance. Cleaning floors, organizing supplies, and assisting with after-school programs felt far beneath someone of her stature, or so she thought. Each task, no matter how small, grated against the image she'd built of herself as someone above it all. But as the days turned into weeks, cracks began to form in her armor of arrogance. The youth center, buzzing with life and resilience, slowly started to affect her in ways she hadn't anticipated. One afternoon, Jessica was tasked with tutoring Tasha, a 14-year-old girl with big dreams of becoming a lawyer. Tasha's eyes sparkled with ambition as she pored over a thick textbook, eagerly asking Jessica for help with a complicated debate assignment. Jessica initially approached the task with indifference, but as she saw Tasha's determination, she couldn't help but be impressed. "Why do you want to be a lawyer?" Jessica asked, half curious. "To make sure people like my mom don't get treated unfairly." Tasha replied without hesitation. She worked hard all her life, but some people act like that doesn't matter. Jessica was struck silent. Tasha's words stayed with her long after their session ended, nudging Jessica toward an uncomfortable truth. Not everyone had the privileges she took for granted. Another pivotal moment came during a lunchtime conversation with Mr. Carter, the center's director, a kind but firm man in his 50s. He shared stories about the challenges faced by the families who relied on the center. "These kids," he said, gesturing toward the bustling room of children, "they wake up every day fighting battles most people don't even know exist. But they keep going. You can't teach that kind of strength." Jessica found herself listening more than she spoke, a rarity for her. The children's laughter, the staff's dedication, and the resilience woven into the center's atmosphere began to chip away at her sense of entitlement. A turning point came during a youth center fundraiser. Jessica, leaning on her family's connections, helped secure sponsorships for the event. For the first time, she used her privilege for a purpose beyond herself. As the night unfolded and the fundraiser exceeded its goals, Jessica felt something she hadn't in years. Pride not in her wealth or status, but in contributing to something meaningful. Her time at the center also fostered unexpected bonds. Tasha won her debate competition, and as she hugged Jessica in celebration, a genuine smile crossed Jessica's face. For the first time, she felt the impact of giving without expecting anything in return. Late one evening, after another long day at the center, Jessica sat alone in her car, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror. For the first time, she didn't see the untouchable socialite she'd always been. She saw someone who had been blind to the struggles of others and had hurt people with her indifference. Her transformation wasn't complete, but a shift had begun. The walls of arrogance she'd built around herself were crumbling, replaced by the faint outlines of empathy and humility. Jessica's remaining days at the center passed with less resistance and more genuine effort. She no longer complained about cleaning or organizing supplies, and her interactions with the children became warmer and more authentic. She even began volunteering for extra shifts, surprising the staff. Mr. Carter noticed a change and pulled her aside one day. "You're starting to get it," he said with a knowing smile. Jessica didn't reply, but the glimmer of understanding in her eyes spoke volumes. Jessica's time at the Harmony Youth Center had come to an end. The mandatory hours were completed, but the experiences she gained during those weeks were far from over. The courtroom was her next destination, a place that once symbolized her defiance, but now the Jessica who walked into Judge Reed's courtroom was almost unrecognizable. Gone were the exaggerated designer accessories and the air of entitlement. She wore a modest outfit and entered quietly, her expression subdued. The usual murmurs in the courtroom were present, but they now carried a tone of curiosity. What would Jessica Halstead have to say today? As she approached the bench, Judge Reed observed her carefully. His sharp gaze, which once seemed to pierce through her arrogance, softened slightly. He gestured for her to speak. "Your Honor," Jessica began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I came here weeks ago thinking this was all a mistake, that I was being treated unfairly. I didn't understand the seriousness of my actions or the harm they caused. I see that now." Her eyes briefly darted toward the gallery, where Mrs. Alvarez and Mr. Jameson sat, their expressions a mix of curiosity and guarded hope. Jessica turned back to Judge Reed. "I want to apologize, not just to you or the court, but to the people I hurt. Mrs. Alvarez, Mr. Jameson, I'm sorry. I was selfish, thoughtless, and completely out of line." The courtroom fell silent. For the first time, Jessica's apology wasn't defensive or insincere. It was raw and genuine. Judge Reed leaned forward slightly, his presence commanding as ever. "Miss Halstead, accountability isn't just about completing a sentence or paying a fine. It's about understanding the impact of your actions and committing to do better. It seems that, for the first time, you've begun to understand that." Jessica nodded, her gaze steady. "I know I have a long way to go, Your Honor, but my time at the youth center opened my eyes to a world I didn't even know existed. It's changed me, and I want to keep learning." To everyone's surprise, Mrs. Alvarez stood up. "Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I've seen the news about Jessica and how hard she's worked. I can see that she's trying. That's all I ever wanted, for her to understand." The judge nodded appreciatively, then turned to Mr. Jameson, who added, "She's shown growth, and that's worth something. I hope she keeps at it." Judge Reed addressed Jessica one last time. "Miss Halstead, growth is a journey, not a destination. Remember that. You've taken the first steps, But it's up to you to continue down this path. He paused before concluding. Case closed. Jessica left the courtroom feeling lighter, not because her sentence was over, but because she had earned a second chance. The courtroom hearing was behind her, but Jessica Halstead's journey was far from over. As she stepped out into the brisk morning air, the weight of her past actions seemed to lift slightly. While the sentence had been fulfilled, her newfound understanding of accountability and privilege ignited a desire for lasting change. Jessica returned to the Harmony Youth Center, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. The children greeted her warmly, and even Tasha, the girl who had challenged Jessica to see beyond her privilege, gave her a knowing smile. Jessica threw herself into supporting the center, organizing fundraisers, securing donations from her influential connections, and advocating for programs that empowered disadvantaged youth. The same resources she once flaunted without thought were now tools for building a better future. Months later, Jessica was invited to speak at a community forum. Standing at the podium, she looked out at the crowd, community members, youth advocates, and even Judge Reed, who had quietly taken a seat in the back of the room. When I first walked into that courtroom, I thought I was above it all. Jessica began. I thought privilege meant immunity, but I was wrong. Privilege means responsibility, to understand, to grow, and to use it for the good of others. Her words struck a chord, drawing applause. She used her platform to highlight systemic inequalities, vowing to support programs that provided opportunities to those who lacked them. Jessica's transformation wasn't limited to public acts. In her personal life, she made conscious changes. She volunteered regularly, reconnected with friends she dismissed in her arrogance, and pursued education on social justice issues. Her mansion, once a symbol of excess, became a hub for community events and fundraisers. Jessica had turned her life of luxury into a force for good. Back at the courthouse, Judge Reed reviewed a letter Jessica had sent him, a handwritten note expressing gratitude for the sentence that changed her life. As he read her words, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, not in himself, but in the system's ability to foster redemption when wielded with purpose. He leaned back in his chair, gazing out the window at the bustling city below. His decision had sparked debate, but it had also sparked change. Jessica's transformation was proof that justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about the possibility of growth. Jessica's journey became a symbol of accountability and second chances. Her advocacy led to scholarships for underprivileged youth and funding for community centers like Harmony. She even began mentoring young women, sharing her story to inspire others to confront their biases and embrace empathy. Jessica stood before a group of high school students at one of her outreach events. "It's not about where you start," she said, her voice steady with conviction. "It's about what you choose to do with the lessons life gives you." As the students applauded, Jessica smiled. Her transformation wasn't just about redemption. It was about using her second chance to ensure others had the opportunity to succeed.